Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Tran, and I am the Children's Librarian at Richland Library, North Main, as well as a member of the Let's Talk Race team. Thank you for joining this evening's Richland Library event, Food Brings Us Together, where we're going to hear from local restaurant owners and a USC professor about the Asian and Asian American experience, as well as how food, in this case, delicious Asian cuisine, really does bring us together. This program is a collaborative effort between Richland Library's Let's Talk Race team and our UNIVOLS team. Let's Talk Race was formed in 2016 and transformed into what it is now. The Let's Talk Race team's purpose is to create opportunities for civic engagement, build community connections, and encourage courageous conversations. The UNIVOLS team has worked together to increase services to Hispanic and Latinx residents in Richland County through programming, a new Facebook page, story times, system-wide translations, and career coaching. I know you're excited to hear what our panelists have to say tonight, but before we meet them, I'd like to first introduce you to tonight's moderator, Bach Pham. Bach is a cultural anthropologist and freelance writer living in Columbia, South Carolina. He received his undergraduate degree in anthropology at the University of South Carolina and his graduate degree in anthropology at East Carolina University. His background includes research on child welfare issues in South Carolina and food inequality. He has been a local freelance food writer for the Free Times, Post and Courier Columbia since 2015. And he enjoys spending time learning about the local food community and sharing stories from all walks of life in the Midlands. Without further ado, I now introduce you to Bach Pham.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for Food Brings Us Together, Asian American Experiences in Columbia, a community we love dearly. Thanks so much to Richland Library for giving our amazing panelists and myself an opportunity to have tonight's conversation and share a bit about our backgrounds and stories. Tonight, we're here to both celebrate the work of our members of the AAPI community, talk about experiences as Asian Americans growing up and or working in the American South, and also talk about some of the issues regarding Asian American and Pacific Islander hate that's risen during the past year. I definitely want to jump in excitedly and introduce our guests so we can get the conversation going. First, we have Sunshine Cobb, co-owner of Cow Thai with her mom, Guy Wilson. A healthcare worker and local restaurant owner living in downtown Columbia, Sunshine and her mom, Guy, who has run the successful Thai restaurant Tamarind in Asheville, opened Cow Thai in 2019, providing downtown an upscale Thai dining experience. Sunshine received her undergraduate degree in business management from the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina, and her graduate degree in health administration from the Norman J. Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. Welcome, Sunshine. Next, we have Shige.
Hey, everyone.
Next, we have Shige Kobayashi. Cayman is an absolute mainstay of the Columbia area, open since 1985, which is incredible in its own right, and something which we'll get into this evening. While Shige has become an essential part of managing his family's restaurant at Cayman, he's also become a strong advocate for the city over the years. The list of ways he's gotten involved is vast, from getting the community registered in voting to working on the census, to co-creating independent magazine Subpar, a unique concept aimed at bettering Columbia, to solving problems identified with locals in the local Free Times newspaper, to participating in multiple local TED Talk events, to creating the popular phrase Columbia. Shige has a wide range of cultural impacts on the city over the past 10 to 15 years. That's made him a beloved figure in the area. Hey Shige.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Finally, we have Dr. Sul-Gi Lee, Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Lee received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2014. His work ranges from studies of African American literature to Blackness and anti-Blackness, Afro-Asian studies, and racial misinjury studies. Dr. Lee has several publications, including an excellent recent article on when Asian American life is grievable, which goes into the AAPI discrimination that's risen to national attention this year and the complicated dynamics behind it. Highly recommend this read if you get a chance later. Some areas of Dr. Lee's work includes Asian or African American literature, Blackness, anti-Blackness, and Afro-Asian studies, and I'm excited to have him here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for everyone for being here tonight. I want to open the floor with some discussion to help our audience. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, everyone, by the way. It means a tremendous amount to all of us to have you here. To help to kind of learn a little bit more about each of you, I'd love to start with Sunshine. Can you tell us first a bit about yourself, how long you've been in Columbia, and also about starting CowThai and the inspiration for opening it with your mom?
Sure, yeah, thank you for having me tonight. So I am a South Carolina native. I grew up in the upstate in Greenville and moved down here for college in '07 and just never really moved away. I grew up in small restaurants and small business, family business, of course. My mom owned a restaurant in Greenville all throughout high school. So I've been working since a young age. And, I really kind of fell in love with Columbia when I moved here for college. And she's been running Tamarind in Asheville for this entire time that I've been in college, and for 13 years now. And she was looking to open a place in Columbia. And, I said, I think there's room for this somewhere in the Vista. We wanted to really share Thai culture with Columbia and help diversify the food scene. So that is a little bit about us and CowThai.
Great, thanks so much. Shige obviously came in as a big part of your life between working there and family connections, and we'll definitely go into that this evening. But I'm really interested in your community involvement work and kind of wanted to touch on that for a little bit. How did you become interested in doing so many different local activities, whether it's creating locally oriented projects like Subpar or working on the census? Where did that interest come for you?
I'm really sorry, my video kicked out for a little bit there, but you were asking about my community involvement, was it?
Yes, just kind of working in the different projects like Subpar, working on census, talking a lot about voting last year. Can you talk a little bit about how you got wrapped into the different topics over the years?
Sure. Well, to be honest, I love getting involved with people, and I think of my goal as helping. I've always I grew up in South Carolina, and as a teenager, I worked here in Come One Japanese restaurant, and as a teenager, I was like a server in the restaurant, and I think that serving kind of background really created a need for me to be sort of useful and helpful to people, and I always tried to find ways to be useful and helpful to people, and being in a place like Columbia, it's really neat because there's a lot of opportunities to be able to help out in like kind of clever ways, and it's a lot of it is I try to entertain myself and those around me while also doing something positive.
That's great. Dr. Lee, I wanted to ask you first off a bit more about your background, kind of where you grew up and how you came to be here in South Carolina. Then I'd like to follow up with how you got into your research interest, which is really interesting to me. African-American literature, to studying Blackness and anti-Blackness studies. I would love to hear more about that.
I'm very proudly a Pan-Carolinian. I grew up the road in the Triangle in North Carolina, and I'm very happy to be here. This is my 4th academic year on the faculty at the University of South Carolina. I spent a lot of time on the West Coast in the Asian American cultures of both Northern and Southern California, and moved here most directly from LA. So, I'm a proud Carolinian because I gave up that life in order to be here. And I would say that my interest in Black studies and the study of anti-Blackness as well as Blackness all stems from my pride in being Asian American. That if you study the term, if you study the movements that we have a special privileged inheritance to. You'll learn that Asian American is actually a pro-Black, pro-POC identity. And so that's the two kind of main facets of my kind of static identity. I'm very proudly from the Carolinas, and I'm also very proudly Asian American.
That's great. Thanks so much for that. I definitely want to touch on that more later tonight, but I just want to go ahead and kind of break it open a little bit for a broader discussion. We have a large number of topics tonight on the table that I want to go ahead and get us kind of going on. Starting with living in the South as a member of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Each of you have lived in Columbia a different amount of time and through different periods of your life. I'd love to kind of walk through a bit about your thoughts on your experience as Asian American in the South. I moved here from the Midwest, from Iowa in 2005 to go to USC. And I'm getting very close to the breaking point of having lived here longer than the Midwest, which I'm still grappling with, but we won't go there. But I think a lot about growing up in both settings and how different it has been living here compared to my time in the Midwest. And obviously it's two different time experiences. But there's other things too with a smaller Asian community here compared to where I was coming from. Especially thinking about when you see members of the AAPI community more frequently, where I was coming from, to suddenly being somewhere where it was maybe every few days, which was kind of a big striking difference for me. So I want to kind of throw out there what influences specific to the South have shaped your identity. And do you feel like your upbringing here in the South in your different capacities provided you with a different lens of how you operate day to day? And we can start with Sunshine.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very, interesting concept, just because for me, I've only really lived in South Carolina. I was actually born in Atlanta, and remember going to Thai Temple and being, very much a part of a larger Asian community when I was a child, but moved to Greenville in middle school and really grew up my entire life in South Carolina. So I'd imagine for somebody like Dr. Lee, who spent a lot of time on the West Coast, it's probably very different. For me, I don't think I know any better. I grew up with, predominantly, I grew up in suburbs of Greenville. So predominantly, white friends. I think that I did have the privilege of having some diversity as far as in our group. Greenville, is not rural by any means, so definitely more city life, I guess, comparative, but definitely suburbs. So, I think growing up, as an Asian American, you kind of always know you're different, and I've been very, again, blessed to have friends that were interested in my culture and my heritage, but at the same time, you do a lot of things to try and fit in. I don't think I have an accent necessarily, but I definitely have y'all a lot. I do that a lot, as we all do probably. And then, in college, just being at USC, there's definitely a difference between going to an SEC school and having kind of the fraternity sorority scene versus something up north, somewhere else up north or out west even. So I would say, I like how Dr. Lee said it. I'm a proud Carolinian, but also a proud AAPI member of the AAPI community. So I think kind of dual there, dual identity.
That's great. I think I am guilty of saying y'all pretty commonly now as well. Shige, do you want to talk about your experience a bit?
Sure. Why shouldn't we say y'all? I think that's it's an excellent word, and it has to do with. I mean, I use it all the time. I used it all the time growing up, and it's my word too, kind of. But yeah, I grew up in South Carolina. I grew up in West Columbia. Have been here all my life. I went to school at Oberlin College in Ohio for 4 years, but outside of those 4 years, I've spent all my time here in South Carolina. And this is what I know. And it's funny because, like Sunshine mentioned, you have this awareness that you're different, and people do treat you a specific way because you're Asian. But there's a lot of things that that is just in the air we breathe as Southerners, I think. For instance, I had a friend visit from California, and while we were driving one day, I said, hey, we should get some boiled peanuts. And we pulled over to one of those tiny little stands with boiled peanuts. And this friend from California was like, what is this? And he had never heard of it. He had never had it before. And it blew my mind because I didn't know that that wasn't something you always stop to get on a Saturday afternoon. And so like growing up in the South is definitely part of me in ways that even I probably don't realize. And at the same time, I am often treated like somebody who's from somewhere else. And I've noticed that over the years.
That's great. I think the bowl of peanut thing is very interesting too. Not really having grown up with it in Iowa and coming here, it still felt oddly natural just because of the kind of food I was eating. So it didn't feel like a strange thing. But when I started talking to different people about it, I realized how different it was for certain people, which was really interesting to think about. Dr. Lee, can you share a little bit about your experience?
Sure, I'll just piggyback off of the YALL thing for a second. YALL was one of the first words in English that I learned when I was 6 years old. And it's extremely useful in our day and age because as the interpolative guys starts becoming extinct because of the gendered implications of saying you guys, we Southerners have this kind of privileged access to just using y'all as that descriptor. So it's extremely, extremely handy to have that on our tongue. So I'll say that. For any hip hop heads out there, I know J. Cole dropped his latest album a couple of Fridays ago, but the greatest rapper of greatest MC from the Carolinas is a Japanese American named G. Yamazawa. And he is the son of, his parents owned the best sushi restaurant where I'm from called Yamazushi. And he has this song called Love Like. And in that song, he talks about how he overcame and negotiated his own racial identity, very much in the register that Shiggy was talking about, feeling like a perpetual foreigner in a Black-white racial context. But he overcame that and negotiated that in this song, what he calls a Southern state of being. And that's what he means. So there's this way in which Asian Americans in the South have a particular privileged access to all the good stuff of Southern culture, particularly African-American culture. And so I think Afro-Asian connection culturally is kind of built into the Asian American experience here. So one example of this is that, you know, the group of Asian Americans, until the film Minari made its splash earlier this year, the group of Asian Americans that was most famous from our region are the Mississippi Delta Chinese Americans, right? Who are the descendants of coolie laborers who were brought in after slavery was abolished and sharecropping became its own thing, but it was profitable to have Chinese laborers imported to do that work. And they made their own foodways and sold food to sharecropping Black folks in the South who couldn't have access to other to markets otherwise. And so the Chinese American dishes that they've created in the Mississippi Delta are Afro-Asian by definition, that they use ham hocks and bacon, right, in their fried rice and using their woks, from the jump. And so that's another kind of cool advantage that Asian Americans in the South kind of have claim to.
That's really interesting. And I kind of want to piggy off that too, and kind of talk about a little bit about representation in pop culture briefly. Kind of an open-ended question. In pop culture for the Asian American community, we often see things like dumplings, dragon iconography for Eastern and Southeastern Asians, and for our South Asian friends, curries and spices. Special shout out to the South Asian community, by the way, who's often underrepresented when we're talking about AAPI. I don't know if you have any history of this further, Dr. Lee, and you want to go into it, but I'd love to hear any general thoughts you have about Asian representation in pop culture, especially regarding the food. And that's kind of an open question for all of you.
Sure, I'll just say this brief thing. I think the generation that's coming up after us they're proudly claiming Asian American cultural space and identity as its own space in ways that actually feel a little bit unfamiliar to me, even though I directly benefit from it and I'm embedded in it. The folks coming up younger than us really claim that as their own identity, and a lot of that is through foodways and through cuisine. And so, you know, you take a dish like, or you take a drink like boba, for example, right? And there's boba shops in every corner, and we have J&J here in downtown. But one of the ways in which, right, that boba came from Taiwan, then to California, and then went back to East Asia, right? It's trans-Pacific crossings in both directions, and then became this kind of complicated symbol of Asian American identity in this new generation. And so I'm really grateful for that, and grateful for the ways in which food kind of links us and kind of provides the possibility of a group identity. Sriracha is the same way. People think of Sriracha. If you go to Publix downtown, right, you find it in the Asian foods aisle. And I always make a joke about that, because that rooster sauce, that bottle, that's from Irwindale, California, right? It was created in the United States by Asian Americans, by Vietnamese American. So Huy Fong Foods in Irwindale this is a uniquely Asian American product, right? It didn't come from Vietnam. And it was created because of the plethora of pho shops in Southern California because of Vietnamese immigration and refugees settling there. And so again, and there wasn't an easy pathway to have sauces that went with pho, right, at that time. And so again, this is another kind of way in which Asian Americanness is this unique, right, cultural phenomenon and cultural status that some of our cultural products in the 21st century refer to.
I have to say, I've seen that at Kamwon as well. I've worked in this space since I've worked here during the 90s and the last 2 decades as well. And it's really interesting to see the effects of pop culture on the diners who come in, and the folks recently are very knowledgeable about Japanese foods, and I see a lot of influence of Japanese media or like media like anime and things like that. So like folks will see a delicious hot pot of sukiyaki or something, and they'll come to our restaurant to try to enjoy that. And I see them like, acting out some of their favorite scenes in their favorite shows. And that's really interesting. And then, but if you go back, maybe in the 80s and 90s, all that people seem to be aware of as far as Asian or East Asian cultures were like martial arts and raw fish, I think. And so you can really see it in the ways that people order food here, as well as the questions that they ask and the things that they come in knowing about.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with Shige there. I mean, I think that over the years, I mentioned one of the reasons we really wanted to open a restaurant in Columbia was just to help diversify the food scene. And I mean, I think, we honestly still get to, to this day, like folks that have never had Thai food before. So I know Thai is a little bit not as, ingrained as far as sushi. It's a little bit, there are folks out there that still have not had Thai food. So I think there's only like us and 929, all the other Asian places that, kind of hop on this trend. I mean, that is part of what makes us successful, is the fact that folks are learning about it. Like you even notice like on those cool, like DoorDash commercials or whatnot now, like pad thai and boba is like kind of featured on that commercial as like part of one of the just like tacos. It's kind of mainstream media. And don't get me started on third-party deliveries, so that's a whole nother probably panel there. But yeah, I think Asian culture definitely influences a lot of mainstream media and vice versa as far as pop culture. There's a whole K-pop phenomenon now, which everyone has jumped on. So I completely agree.
Yeah, fantastic points all around. And the Sriracha point's really interesting. As a Vietnamese American kind of growing up, it really shocked me when I suddenly started seeing Sriracha in different contexts, but because it was exactly like you said, it was our dipping sauce for eating pho for years, and it was just something I grew up with. And then just suddenly to go in a restaurant and see people pouring it over different foods or pouring it over their pho, which is another conversation for a private rant I'll have another time. But just seeing it being used publicly is both good and bad in different contexts, just because of the misunderstanding. So it's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you brought it up. And kind of related to where we were kind of going here, I'd really like to talk about your feelings about Columbia's growth with the AAPI community in the last 10 years, and also a reception to international food in general. Obviously, we've had a lot of growth. We've seen a lot of businesses like Cow Thai and 929 and Bodie in Lexington and others. We've seen growth in other international sectors too. The Latin community has grown quite a bit. We have some fantastic restaurants around the city, and we have some fantastic African cuisine too, which has slowly gained traction, including like a Sanka, Harambe, which is fantastic to have in a city our size, which we're pretty fortunate. So just kind of in general, how do you feel like from your experience of living here from like the last 5-10 years? How have things changed for better or worse, and what do you think about the growth? And maybe start with Shige.
I really like it. I think it's great to have a lot of those places. You mentioned a lot of great independent restaurants that are serving like interesting things on their menu. Some of the things that are trying kind of new things aside from what somebody may expect from certain, like dining at a place with a country's name on it. I think y'all may, Sunshine and Dr. Lee, you might be able to educate me a little bit more, but my understanding is that like for a lot of Thai restaurants for a long time, there was a very standardized menu of items that would come from what you would think to order in a Thai restaurant, but now there's a lot of kind of option and beauty out there. In addition to what like the foundation of what people have come to expect. I am really into like lots of different flavors and lots of different things to choose from in our community, and it has really grown in a lot of different ways. I don't have access to a lot of those, like the communities of people behind those restaurants necessarily, but I'm really curious about how those communities may be growing in our area as well.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. You're exactly right, Shige. I think, our concept for opening Cow Thai was, we are inherently Thai. That is kind of our heritage, and that's what our experience is. But, your kind of mom and pop Thai restaurant, which is what Tamarind is really, you go in, the menu is a book, like a 5-page book. And it's like, choose your meat, choose your sauce or whatnot for stir fries. You got your standard pad thais and pad sees, your noodles and stuff. And, I think for us, we really tried to keep our menu core to kind of what the staples would be, but really kind of eliminate all the other things to make room for kind of that creative, different type of fusion, and really be kind of a pan-Asian eatery. I think I don't by any means mean to compare us to Atlanta, but there are some places in Atlanta that are really pan-Asian restaurants, like Food Terminal. There's also like Laotian places, which I think a lot of, the clientele nowadays, they like to see new things as far as like street food and things that, are foreign to like your typical kind of Americanized Thai menu. So we have, trying to get over COVID this year, but hopefully we'll introduce some more fun Thai things and food, so kind of street food things that are new. And I agree. I like it a lot too. I think even with Soda City, over like when I moved here for college, I mean, that, you didn't even go downtown really to Main Street. And so even, arepa is, like to your point, is really a staple now at Soda City. Paella, I mean, it's great to see all the diversity. And I think as the college and university grows, it really allows, the city to continue to be a melting pot. There's that clientele there. So hopefully it only progresses and increases even more over the next 10 years.
And Dr. Lee, I want to pass the question to you as well, but also ask for your perspective coming from some time in the West Coast and kind of comparing your experiences.
Yeah, so as the newest person to South Carolina, I'll rep for the oldest restaurants first. So I wouldn't have lasted 4 years on the faculty here without Pho Viet near campus. So you can usually find me there between classes. And so having that walking distance from my office in non-pre-pandemic conditions is very important to me. And then I'll also rep for I was just reading something about how the preponderance of sushi bars on both coasts actually started in the early to mid 1980s in this country. So Cayman was on the first wave of that. And so, shout to Shiggy and his family, right, for catching that wave and for being real pioneers in that space. And then there's all these other kinds of weird kind of Pan-Asian spaces that you find in town. So when I first moved here, I lived down the street from this place called China Hut Ace, which is a kind of hole in the wall, right, Chinese restaurant that boasts on its marquee the best wings in town. And so, and you go in there and it's Korean immigrants, who have been running that place for decades, right? So it's Korean Americans running a Chinese American restaurant, Chinese American cuisine in an African American neighborhood. And so, that's right. That's a very cool thing to see. And so I'm really grateful for those spaces. And also, when I was growing up in Chapel Hill and Durham, we didn't have Korean restaurants. And so it was very, so I rep for Obok and Korea Garden and Kimchi and those spaces as well out on Decker for those reasons. Being able to go to a Korean restaurant is still something of a novelty to me, given that I wasn't able to do that as a child. Compared to the West Coast, I would say that the kinds of fusion that are acceptable or that are kind of embraced by the cool people, the young POC in the cities, that's something that I would like to see more of in Columbia. So you think about the founder, the OG of food truck culture, Chef Roy Choi and his Kogi trucks. And I would be on Twitter looking for that truck. But I also happen to live by the first brick and mortar Kogi taco shop. And you see him on TV or you would see him on the street, Korean American guy came over in a certain generation and he's speaking fluent Spanish with all his, with all his customers and with all his employees. And so that kind of pan people of color cuisine, right? That's kind of we think of now as indigenous to Los Angeles or Oakland. That's something that I really got to embrace when I lived on the West Coast.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that a little bit, I really like this kind of phase we're at in Columbia, where it's sort of a way of thinking about Asian food or ethnic food or what people might use there's kind of an older phase where people were really concerned with the level of authenticity, that word in quotes there, of a food. And they really wanted to make sure they were eating like the real version of whatever it is that they were eating. And there's some things to value in there because you want a connection to like a history of the history of some culture or the history of some ethnicity, but there's so much in kind of the global way we have a conversation among different groups of people and among different food lovers and cooks who are making really interesting foods. Nowadays, we're able to enjoy some really interesting dishes from chefs all over. I was just talking with Chef Alex Strickland over at Black Rooster, and he does a different ramen every Tuesday. and during the pandemic, he was prepackaging things like bao and items that he was able to get from his time, I think working with a Momofuku noodle bar. So like those kind of things are really interesting. I love it when I have a friend and a former cook here at Kamon who's a Korean gentleman, Steve Ju. He after working here, he went off to culinary school and then moved to Korea for a couple of years, where he studied with farmers and cooks there and really learned just old techniques of Korean cooking, and took it back to his home state of California, where he is building restaurant concepts that are about those very old food production techniques on local ingredients from California, and making something that I would think of as a really interesting, like, Korean American food. So I really like the space that we're in now. There's a lot of conversation going back and forth across borders and generations that is like amazing.
I completely agree. There's a lot of wonderful things going on. It raises kind of a bigger question of what authenticity really means, because like you were saying, a lot of people seek what they think is their ideal, but everyone's different and everyone has personal lived experiences, and it's always interesting to see, especially for chefs, the kind of food that comes out of their minds through their experiences, through their living. I do want to touch briefly about for Sunshine and Shiyu, their second generation kind of experience, specifically working with members of family in the restaurant industry. What kind of conversations have y'all had about the restaurants that you both are part of, and kind of the future? Is that a conversation that you've had, and what has that been like? And I'll start with Sunshine this time.
Sure, yeah. I think for any Asian American, especially second generation, your parents have immigrated to a country where they didn't know the language. They've really paved the way. In the case of my mom, she was the first member from her family to ever leave Thailand. And so she came here in her 20s, younger than I am now. And it's just amazing to think of that. And so I think there is this inherent, as you're growing up, pressure to perform and do well. I mean, that stereotype is probably true in any Asian family, I feel like. But as far as taking on the restaurant business, I actually went to college to get my master's in health administration to get out of restaurants, which is really ironic. So here I sit, and I don't know that there's a ton of pressure from her side as far as to take it on and have that legacy. But I do think that there is, of course, this realization that it's being an entrepreneur in itself and a business owner is a huge, privilege. It's kind of the epitome of the American dream, if you will. So by no means am I ungrateful. I just think that, the conversations we've had is we'll keep it going as long as we can to kind of leave that legacy. But, she's always been very supportive of me in another career, if that's kind of what I want to do. So I know that not everyone has that luxury. So I'm very, very grateful and humbled.
Yeah, that's great. This is virtual meeting here is the first time I'm meeting Sunshine, and to hear that she's a second generation restaurateur is really interesting to me, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation about that. Generation is a pretty interesting word here in this context, because my parents, my mother and my father opened up Kamon in Columbia in 1985. And so last year, 2020, marked 35 years of our restaurant. And what we've been saying, like this pandemic has truly changed us forever. And it's changed around some like retirement plans for my parents and things like that. So when we say that what we've been saying this past year is that like we we've written a chapter that's the first 35 years of Kamun, and we're trying to figure out what the second 35 years of Kamun look like. And we're excited to write that out. And part of that is we have been working with, there are 3 cooks who we've worked with over the past 20 years, and they're all brothers, named the Bowens. They're half Japanese, half white, Asian Americans, and they're each of those 3 brothers, their first restaurant job was here at Kamun. And they've spent a lot of time with my father. We call them the new guys, and we think of them as, I keep thinking of them as new, but they seriously started working with us in 2003 or something. So we're coming up on 20 years of working together in various contexts. And they have taken on kind of a generational mantle of the restaurant itself. They're much better cooks than I am, and they've really worked with my father. My father has really worked with them in terms of teaching them his sort of food philosophies and his cooking philosophies, as well as the techniques, of course. So that's kind of how I think about that generationally. Earlier when I was having kind of difficulty with my internet here, I mentioned that I was really into the idea of like helping and being able to kind of serve, whether it's at a table full of diners or it's the kind of wider community. So to be able to like serve these Bowen brothers and their family, and to be able to serve my father has been, it's been a lot of fun, because a lot of great people have come through and really knowledgeable diners, and it's really interesting to just be here, kind of like on the main drag on Assembly Street here. So that's kind of what I can say to sort of this generational thing, that there's multiple definitions of that word happening, generations of those who've cooked and who've learned in the space, and generations like blood generations of my family.
Thanks for that. Before we switch gears, I want to kind of ask one final question about COVID. It's such a big part of our last year. For each of you, can you talk a little bit about COVID has affected you from work to personal life? And for Dr. Lee, your work teaching as well. I'd love to hear each of your perspectives. And we can start.
Should I go first?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, sure. So again, I'll just echo my friends that I'm not in the restaurant game, but my mother caught the wave of self-serve frozen yogurt. And so she had a self-serve frozen yogurt shop in Wake Forest, North Carolina for 10 years. And I sat there and wrote my entire doctoral dissertation there over the summers, binging on frozen yogurt. And we lost that store during the pandemic. And so there's one location still out there in Apex. It's called Sweet Spoon's Frozen Yogurt, if anybody's up traveling in the Triangle anytime soon. And so that's been one implication of the pandemic for my family. Generally, I would say that, the pandemic has really shown the class stratification within our group, that the folks who could kind of, sit on Zoom and keep their paychecks going. A lot of those folks had family members who were struggling with, getting their unemployment, navigating the bureaucracy, especially about a year ago. And so there's been a wide range of experiences just within my family and within my immediate community in terms of the fallout from the pandemic conditions. We have, Asian Americans, AAPI, we have the widest income stratification of the racial groups in the United States. So, we were bound to all feel that in individuated ways. So that's one thing. And then of course the, rise in the kind of onslaught of bigotry and violence, including murder in this period that's kind of marked our group as a kind of special attention, special national attention, especially in 2021. It's ongoing. That kind of racist hatred and violence is not new, but it was intensified because of the pandemic conditions.
Sunshine, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think, of course, COVID, with it being kind of a worldwide pandemic, I think there, the silver lining, and I know it's really been a struggle for everyone, but the silver lining in it all, I think, is just kind of the awareness that I think it's brought to society, as far as it being kind of a wake up call for some of, the racism and racial tension. I think as a restaurant owner, just dealing with not only the pressures of running a small business, local business, but also having to balance that with, everyone has their individual feelings and preferences and comfort level for themselves, their family, for safety, all the way from, employees to customers. And then really just with kind of how reactionary, I guess, the media is these days, just really being as careful as you can as a business owner to not, really trying to make the right decision for your employees and for your customers. I think it's a lot of pressure. I mean, we were lucky to just be able to run takeout the entire time. And so if there is, like I said, a silver lining to any of it, just awareness, I think that it's kind of broad all around.
Yeah, every restaurant had to make a lot of their own decisions as the pandemic went on, just right from the beginning, trying to figure out what the right choices are. So, like Sunshine was saying, it's a lot of impossible choices that we all had to make. I think early when it seemed like that this was spreading, and that people in sort of the age danger zone that my father was in, working so closely with a few other people, we couldn't figure out a way to make it work. And so we closed our doors for service, and we signed our staff up for unemployment benefits, and we're like, well, let's see what the next few weeks will bring, right? That's what we were looking at, just a few weeks, kind of at the beginning. And then as things wore on, and as some of our leaders seemed to be making disease extending decisions, and the choices became even harder, we talk with those former staff members. I'm just going to talk out my feelings here. I don't really know where I'm going, but there's a number of things I want to hit. Right now, I think are thinking about reopening our dining room in some capacity, and searching for staff has been difficult, as is widely kind of reported. But I've been thinking about that because the staff that did work with us, they may have held on for the first month or two during lockdown, but after a while they did start searching for work in other fields. So there are many people out there today who would otherwise be working in restaurants who are now working in other fields, and I think that has played the greatest factor as far as just my personal experience, what I've seen. And so I think, like, vilifying one side or the other, or saying that certain people who are making certain employment choices are right or wrong for this and that reason, I think it's kind of undermining the complexity of the issue right now. And so I'm not trying to fault people one way or the other, as many people have had to make impossible decisions over this time.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Because we are racing towards the end of our time, I do want to give us an opportunity to talk about AAPI Hate before we wrap up this evening. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been a steady rise in hate crimes seen in the AAPI community that's garnered national attention. Real quickly, I pulled a few stats from stopaaphate.org. Over 6,603 reports of Asian American racist incidents since March of last year to the end of March this year. There were over 65% of incidents that were verbal harassment, over 64% reported by women. And a final stat that I want to throw out is that 11% were against youth from 0 to 17 years old, which is interesting because a lot of what we've seen in the news is on the Asian American elder community. And I think it's important to show that discrimination is happening on every level of the AAPI community and not just, elders or certain people. I know that's a lot. You can visit stopaapihate.org for more details. There's a lot of great info there. But jumping into the subject though, I wanted to give each of you a chance to talk about how each of you has processed AAPI hate during the past year and how it's played a role in your day-to-day, especially among your family. I know for me, my parents are elder, and it made me really sad to think about that I'm worrying about them going for a walk or just doing everyday activity just based on what was happening in news. And I know they were worrying about it because they watch the news every day too. So I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on the subject. Maybe starting with Dr. Lee.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot to say. I haven't had a moment free to not think about it in a long time. So one thing I would say is that because of my professional positioning and because of the privileges that come with that, I've been extremely disappointed by my coterie, by my cadre of Asian American PhDs whose job it is to talk about racism and talk about white supremacy in really concrete ways. And my group of professional colleagues we've all really dropped the ball on being able to talk about it. Not until March 16 did any of us, including the famous ones with really large book contracts and with thousands of Twitter followers and huge social media presence and access to the New York Times op-ed page and the Atlantic and all that, not until March 16th did we even care to talk about the victims' names, talk about the suffering of the families. And so it's been a real moral and political failure by Asian American intelligentsia in this period. And that's what that piece, Bach, that you mentioned at the beginning that I delivered at the very end of March, 2 weeks after the Atlanta shootings and murders, that's what that was focused on. So it's been a preoccupation of mine for the past year.
Sunshine, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think for me, as I mentioned, growing up in the South, pretty Americanized, if you will, born and raised here in the States, probably have a very different perspective, I think, than someone who's immigrated here. And I think there were a few times where during this period, I think my mom is traveling to Atlanta and it's like, okay, well, just be really careful, and I think, I've really struggled, I think, and in processing, like you mentioned, processing kind of all of the hate stuff out in the media, mainly because I have had just a huge blessing of not being subject to a lot of it. But on the other end, I think it's, growing up, you really train yourself just to brush aside that comment, or, you are the token Asian person, you're just okay with it. I think you kind of are in survival mode a little bit to where you do things to fit in. And, I think a lot of this has come to light. I think it's definitely made me think more on, like, does that make me upset? Like, I'm not sure. I think, so for me personally, I think I'm having a lot of thoughts. I mean, again, like, I've just been very lucky to have friends that really care and have asked me how I'm doing and things like that. And I'm just being vulnerable here and saying, like, I don't really know how I feel about it. So while of course I'm appalled at everything that's happened out there, and I think that a lot of the awareness is it's very, it's kind of, again, about time is kind of my thoughts on it. It's about time that people start realizing that.
Yeah, I have a guess, and my guess is that 100% of the people watching this stream right now are not considering enacting some violence on Asian people strictly because of their race or ethnicity, because we're in like a comfortable space here, right? we're in a, and like Sunshine was saying, I really resonated with that, because I was thinking, as I grew up, you know, I grew up in West Columbia, South Carolina, and as you grow up, you do learn to sort of brush aside the comments, like she said, but you also learn kind of the hacks, the tricks to avoid some confrontations, and it's just a part of how you grow up and how you experience the world. And so when we think about this, the thing that really hit me was earlier today, I was talking with my mother, and she was talking about somebody who kind of maybe pranked her door or something, just rang the doorbell and ran off, and she could see it in her little like doorbell monitor, and is probably innocent, but she mentioned that she was worried that it might be somebody who was coming to hit her or something, because they knew she was Asian, and like that concern was, she was exposed to that concern, and she felt that concern. She felt that, you know, that bit of fear, however large or small amount of it, and it's because we're aware of it now. And I know Bach, you mentioned that it's Stop AAPI Hate organization who started keeping statistics, but the truth is we don't know what the statistics were before last year. And I know it's my understanding that there's going to be a greater effort in legislation to try to keep track of like hate incidents, and I think that's very valuable to be able to even see what the problem is, and to become more aware of it, for sure.
Right. And for those who don't know, just recently, the COVID Hate Crimes Act was signed into law by President Biden last week. It had the main goal of expediting investigation of hate crimes related to COVID in the US and supporting more data collection. It was found that while the bill passed with, you know, pretty decent bipartisan support, over 100 AAPI and LGBTQ organizations banded together against the bill, citing that it didn't do enough change, with few reasons being no resources for violence prevention or general resources to help create actual systemic change to racism, but rather just kind of helping towards the data collection, the actual investigation. I encourage everyone watching to go ahead and out and do a little investigation about the act and the conversation around it. Kind of related to that, because we're kind of getting low on time, I kind of want to give Dr. Lee specifically an opportunity because of your work and the amount of time you spend on it. I'd love to give you a chance to talk a little, maybe give 3 takeaways based on what's happened over the past year, and based on your understanding of the history of AAPI Hate in the United States, that you think the audience would benefit from taking based on recent events.
One thing I would say, Bach, you already framed it, the notion of hate crimes legislation as being very controversial within the Asian American community. That's especially true in academic, progressive, leftist, radical circles. A really good resource on this is an article that came out in Teen Vogue, of all places, about a month ago by James McMaster and Jason Wu. I'll shout out those brothers, and they talk about how hate crimes legislation might actually have a deleterious and violent effect on the communities that they're supposed to protect, because of the ways in which they're implemented and the ways in which, right, and the ways in which they kind of uphold and propagate the police state and systems of mass incarceration and so on. So there's a lively debate happening there. My voice in that debate is simply that I'm fine with having a certain kind of critical consciousness and opposition even to hate crimes legislation. We've only had federal hate crimes legislation since Matthew Shepard, basically, right? So since 1997. So there isn't, we don't know the long-term historical political consequences of hate crimes legislation at a federal level. Living in South Carolina, right, as being, until this past month, one of 3 states that doesn't have any hate crimes legislation on the books, right? It means something a little bit different for us, especially since we live in Dylan Roof's hometown. And so what it means to have hate crimes legislation on the books in South Carolina means something different, I think, than for the nation at large. So that's one thing I would say. And the other thing, the second thing I would say with regard to the hate crimes legislation is that I believe it's really important to call racist hatred what it is. We need to be able to call it hate. And if we have a lot of Asian American intellectuals and politicians running around and saying that calling it hatred individualizes the issue and doesn't provide a structural critique of how anti-Asian racism works. A lot of my colleagues are saying that right now, and they're saying it vehemently, and they call themselves abolitionists because they're against the police state, against prisons, and so on. And in terms of a political sympathy, I'm right there with them, but we have to be able to call it hate. And so that's been my voice in that conversation. The second thing is, with regard to, Sunshine, what you said about Americanization and assimilation, just think about how common it is that white folks that we hang out with who are middle class to upper middle class to the elites, they have this weird cultural political tendency to think of us as just honorary them. We don't experience it that way. We don't go through our lives like that. And yet we're configured like that all the time, right? And that's a real problem. So a lot of the white folks that we've had to live with and work with, right, and even in some cases marry and procreate with and so on, right? The knee-jerk tendency is for racial whiteness to be imposed upon us, right? And this moment of racist violence is reminding everybody that, right, and that we need a new consciousness that shakes the really assimilated, really successful ones of us out of that consciousness. As Shiggy said it, in terms of a kind of survival adaptability, right? It's not our fault that we feel that way, right? We were model minoritized, right? So we have to be able to push back against that. And so statistically speaking, those white folks, right, middle class to elites, sociologically, they live the most segregated lives of anybody else in the United States, right? It's we who have to live with them. We have to be the ones who are integrating those spaces. And so that's a real problem too, culturally and politically, where a lot of our white friends, our white colleagues, our white compatriots, right, are trying to tell us about anti-racism, right? Are trying to tell us about what it means to be woke, what it means to fight against anti-Blackness. And you see that even from my colleagues who work in Asian American studies, right? A lot of the reason for that intellectual professorial silence that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, right, was because the perpetrators of that violence were other people of color. So a lot of Asian Americans started to believe that we can't call out, we can't demand racial justice for our own, the most vulnerable of us, the ones who work in massage parlors, right? The ones who are elderly going for walks, right? Children, like you said, Bach, right? We can't stick up for them because there's some kind of white-coded anti-racism telling us that we would be complicit in anti-Black racism because the perpetrators are African American. That's not true, right? So there's a way in which we need to carve out our own space to talk about these things and to be able to claim our own position.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lee. And I really recommend to the audience because we unfortunately don't have a lot of time. This is a topic that easily could have gone on an hour on its own, right? Because there's just so many different ways to touch on it. But I highly recommend to the audience to check out Dr. Lee's publication, When Asian American Life is Grievable, which delves into some of the things that he's talked about. And to kind of piggyback on that as well, I kind of wanted to get into the final 2 questions. First off, to kind of wrap up our discussion on AAPI hate, what do you think, and this is for all of you, what do you think each individual can do to help support the AAPI community regarding hate crimes in general, small or large, and also representation? And I'll start maybe with Sunshine.
I think that, as far as what each individual person can do, I mean, I think kind of starts with self-awareness, probably. You know, I think we all, even, you know, during the BLM movement as well. I mean, there's definitely inter-race racism also, right? So I think we all have stereotypes in our mind. We all, you know, discriminate to a degree. Of course, not all of it is hatred, but you know, we notice people are different, and I think just being self-aware and being open and really understanding other folks, and you know, that their ideas and thoughts and feelings, that's all part of their walk of life, and that there's room for everybody to kind of have those, you know, on their own. And so I would say, just as far as, you know, what each person can do is just be kind, be kinder, as kind as, you know, I think there's always room for more of that. So.
Shiggy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm going to say, let's go out to more restaurants or order food from more restaurants. And that's not just self-serving. I think that, like, for instance, Come On here, you know, we were started in the 80s, and we are serving Japanese food to Columbia, South Carolina. And so serving people on the weird boundary line between cultures is like our whole deal here. That's like what we do. And so, and I've found great value in it. So if you too, you viewer, if you can find a way to serve people on a weird cultural boundary line that you perceive, I say go for it. I think that's pretty cool. For instance, you may have heard people kind of bouncing back and forth during this talk, calling me Shige, which is kind of more of a Japanese pronunciation. And sometimes people call me Shiggy here in town, which I call my Columbia pronunciation of my name. And the thing is, they're both pronunciations, both Shigeharu and Shiggy, are 100% correct as far as I'm concerned. And that's because I can kind of I have both of these identities. And I think learning about that is a great way to kind of overcome hate. And I'm really into that on the personal level. But I think a lot of it might be kind of bigger, as Dr. Lee has been mentioning. I think the structures in our society is created, especially, you know, probably over a long period of time, but I've noticed that the structures in our society have created a lot of nothing to lose people in our society, and more nothing to lose people. And when we see actions of violence on the news, we have this weird double reaction. One is like, oh my gosh, this violence is rising, there's more of it. It might be one reaction. The other reaction is, this was one incident in one place that's very rare, that was highlighted and shown to me. And it's very rare. And both of those are probably true. But the deal is that the violence that comes as a result of probably structures and lots of people talking that in ways that create division. And I think that the more you create division and then layer on top of that creating nothing to lose people, can result in this kind of violence. So anything you can do to reduce both of those things would be nice. I'd be into that.
I'll say just three really quick things. I'm totally on the sunshine, shiggy, kindness train, obviously. On the other hand, I do think that there is an analytical value in examining our specific racial position as it relates to the emotion of anger. And I think that this is a moment in which collective anger is justified, and it will lead to not just increased mainstream attention to our position, but also just a clarity with regard to our own position and where we are. You know, we should not be silent. We should not just take this in stride in the ways that people already connote to the Asian American position. So that's one thing. The second thing, this is a really important piece of everything I have to say in my entire life, but especially in the context of this meeting, is that people walk around thinking and saying, including some of us, that Asian Americans are like somehow like naturally anti-Black. And that's not true. And there's real implications for that. It's a propagandistic claim, right? Because some of us got to go to the fancy schools and join corporate structures, including academia, that are still predominantly white. A lot of Asian Americans, right, are thought of as being white adjacent more than anything else. But our relationship to the structure of anti-Blackness and white supremacy is fundamentally different from what white folks have. And so that's a really key point. Everybody has that, racist uncle or whatever at Thanksgiving who's spewing anti-Black stuff, but that's anecdotal. There's no empirical evidence out there that shows that Asian American attitudes toward African Americans is worse than the larger nationwide community. But we walk around thinking that. And again, that has huge implications for what we've been going through during the pandemic, right? And Asian Americans reported supporting Black Lives Matter, to Sunshine's point, at the end of summer 2020 at the highest rate of any other ethnic group in the United States, and only slightly lower than African Americans themselves. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind here, right? That this naturalization, the model minoritization of our racial position has huge implications for how we react to this moment of onslaught of racist violence and hatred. And then the last thing is totally related to that, is that after the March 16 shooting, there was even some very well-intentioned, very educated folks, right? Messaging me, telling me that it shouldn't be called Stop Asian Hate. It shouldn't be called Stop AAPI Hate, that it should be called Stop White Supremacy. And I get the intentions of that. On the other hand, right, a lot of the folks who are starting to think about that, right, they want us to have a systematic understanding of how racism works and how it's all white supremacist and that's true. But on the other hand, right, we need to be able to talk about the specificity of our racial position. And so calling it Stop AAPI Hate or Stop Asian Hate is extremely important in this moment, because it draws attention, right, to our specific, right, vulnerability to harm and violence. And not enough people have been saying that, right? I've had lots of Black studies colleagues and professors immediately turn on and say, no, we need to call it Stop White Supremacy, right? And it shows a kind of inattention, ongoing inattention to Asian Americans, right, from people of all walks of life in this country.
Thank you so much to everyone for giving your thoughts on that. Everyone had really fantastic recommendations. I do want to get us to the very end here and also grab some viewer questions before we wrap up this evening. But for my final question, I wanted to talk about the theme of tonight. How does food bring us together? And kind of wrap this up on a bit of a lighter note. Food is basically, for me, right, my family and how we bond on a weekly basis. COVID made it tremendously hard to gather at a table. And that really made me think a lot about the important moments that I share with my family when we do. It's how my mom and I communicate about life daily. And even during COVID, when we couldn't see each other, she was sending me gargantuan amounts of food to my door. And my fiance and I felt somewhat at home, and it made it a little better. I often love sharing the food on social media too, because to be honest, Vietnamese food is hard to find outside of pho and kind of the things that you stereotypically see. So for me, it was a lot of fun to get that during such a difficult time. I'd love for each of you to share a food experience with either you, your family, or friends or loved ones. And also kind of, if you have a story as well about how food has helped bridge cultures between you and a friend. And we can start with Shiggy.
Okay, I'll say kind of a general one. And that's the, this kind of background behind me is the interior of our restaurant, which so many diners have not been able to come to over the past year, and we're still not open for dine-in yet. But this space has been a place where I've seen lots of people gather, and lots of people, families like you mentioned, Bach, but also small micro communities in Columbia there are groups, not just Japanese folks, but you can even drill down a little bit more specific. There's a community of Okinawan people who are from the southern islands in Japan, and they would gather here once a month or so to share meals and stories together. And people from other groups and other cultures would gather around the table. And so it's really neat to see restaurants and dining rooms as spaces where people really can gather and to share and to become, that's part of building a community, right, with other people, where you're spending time with these other people on sort of a regular basis. And to be a venue for that has been really, really nice and rewarding. And it's been fun to witness as somebody who's managing the floor each night, to see different groups gather in a lot of different ways over many, many years.
Sunshine, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, food inherently, I think meals are of course a way for folks to gather, family meals. I think that, food is a way that you get to share your culture with others, no matter if they speak the same language as you or not. And so I do think it's not only flavors, but it's customs and tradition, and it's just very. I think it's great to be able to share with a friend who is not from that culture, kind of what it's like, almost like a little part of you. So I think probably my most memorable story, I think we probably can all relate to a degree. I think growing up, hosting birthday parties at your house, it's you always, as an Asian, and Bach can probably relate to this with Vietnamese food as well. Your Asian, the hors d'oeuvre of the party was always the spring roll. And so I remember my mom rolling spring rolls when I was younger, getting ready for birthday parties and that sort of thing. And at the time, of course, you don't know that that's different. And so your friends come over and they're like, what is this? And so I think, again, just, being able to share that with folks, it's just a way to give them a little peek into your life and your traditions. And food will continue to be that way. And it brings, it kind of reassures you that we all have something in common.
Too real, Sunshine, about the egg rolls. Dr. Lee?
Yeah.
There was this large format photographer from Japan who lived in Asheville in the 1910s and 20s named George Masa. If any of y'all have gone hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains, there's a peak called Masa. He was one of the founders of turning that area into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was a Japanese American. And like Shiggy was saying earlier, in your commitment to service and the capacity to serve others, Masa was dirt poor, and he just loved the mountains, and he paid his bills and made his way by serving, the Biltmore estate folks, the rich people who came down to vacation in the North Carolina mountains. And that was his life. And so there's Asian American presence that's tied to food and tied to service in ways and places that you wouldn't expect. So I would say that's one. And then just this past weekend, I finally got to go to Atlanta and went to pay my respects at Gold Spa and Aromatherapy Spa. And I hadn't planned it in advance, and there was no memorial there or no, the businesses were obviously shut down, but there was no, other than the parking lots being taped off, there was no commemoration. And so it was a very difficult experience to be able to pay our respects. But y'all will remember on that horrific week, the first family to speak out, Randy and Eric Park, they talked about how their mother, Kim Yeon-jung, took them to the nice sushi spots where they lived. And right around the corner from Gold Spa, Aromatherapy Spa, in that thoroughfare, there was a kind of like nice sushi bar that had just reopened. And so we went to get a bite there, and that became part of our memorial trip.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your stories. I do want to hit quickly one or two questions from the audience before we wrap up. This is a playful question. If you could pick one type of Asian or Pan-Asian restaurant to open in downtown Columbia, what would be your pick? And they said theirs would be a Korean bakery, which is a great suggestion. I'd love to see a Vietnamese restaurant that didn't serve pho, which is kind of a bold statement, but just to kind of explore different cuisines. Maybe go around the table, starting with Sunshine.
Sure, that's a really hard question because once again, I feel like, you know, if you guys go to Atlanta, there's just so many choices that we're spoiled with. And of course, I'm not familiar with West Coast, which I'm sure is like even a million times more diverse than Atlanta. But I would have to say probably an Asian bakery of some sort, or I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the Sweet Hut chain, something like that, where it's like pastries, but it's I know this is probably bad for COVID, but self-serve to a degree. But they serve all sorts of yeah, different bakery items, and either that or maybe like a Laotian place where that's like really spicy stuff. So that's probably the top two.
Yeah, I would have to say, yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a question we should ask ourselves all the time. Is like, hey, what other type of restaurant should we have here? What would be an exciting thing to get a chance to eat? But there's a like a small flaw in the question in that we have like a lot of Asian food up and down Gervais Street. If we're talking about like the Vista or downtown Columbia, sometimes you know we at our restaurant, we've carved out kind of a small corner of the Japanese cuisine and even like the sushi universe to serve. And folks come to us for that. But then sometimes people walk in our door expecting something different. And we're able to like walk with them outside the door and like literally point to 2 blocks away. We can say 2 blocks away, and just start walking down Gervais Street, and you'll find like a number of different other like Asian or Asian inspired foods. Including Khao Thai and and a number of places down there. So like there's a lot of really good Asian food. All that said, what would I like to see? I was talking with I think I mentioned I was talking with Chef Alex Strickland at Black Rooster and some other folks that we've talked, and it'd be really neat to see like a Japanese street food kind of place. Since we've been talking about street food in a number of places, like things like okonomiyaki, and or maybe something that's more in line with the izakaya style cooking. So small plates, so Japanese tapas kind of dishes. The chef and I here talk about our favorite izakaya dishes all the time, and that could be a really fun one. But man, if you think we're lacking in Asian food, there's a lot of stuff to get here, and if not here, then up and down Decker Boulevard for a lot of the Korean restaurants that Dr. Lee mentioned. We've got a lot going.
I'm going to say Korean fried chicken.
Yes.
You know, open all night, beer flowing. You get your own booth. One of my oldest friends I call him the mayor of Oakland, Koreatown. He manages all those. He's had experience managing all the Korean restaurants on Telegraph Avenue, and that's the one he and I would always hang out at. So that's a shout out to my friend Zenas. But this that's something that's I feel the lack of that deeply living here.
I want to give a shout out to Khao Thai, who has an excellent version that I hope to share with all of you one day and kick back a few drinks. I think that would be a fantastic time. We have some other questions, but we're running short on time. I want to thank everyone so much for sending questions, and we'll see if we can try to get them addressed another time. I want to say thank you so much to three of you, Sunshine, Shigi, and Dr. Lee, for joining us for this discussion. It's been an amazing evening. I want to send a huge thank you to Richland Library for helping organize this event and giving us an opportunity to have this discussion. Please remember to support your local library, especially the amazing Richland Library system we're very lucky to have here in Columbia. Finally, a special thank you to everyone for taking time on the late Monday night at the start of a work week to hear us talk and ramble about our experiences. We greatly appreciate it. It means a great deal to us, and that you're willing to take the time to take part in this conversation. And we really greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Bach, for moderating and being here this evening. And thank you to our panelists for such an engaging and informative discussion. You've all taught us a lot this evening, and you've given us a lot to think about moving forward. Not to mention, I'm sure you've all made the audience incredibly hungry right now. Thank you also to all of tonight's event attendees. And if you're interested in learning more about the Let's Talk Race team and Univos, please go to richlandlibrary.com/race for more information about our initiatives and future events. We look forward to having you join us again, and thank you all so much. Have a good evening.